This is Janet Teague on the radio, and you are listening to Bring It In with Coach D, where we catch up with coaches and athletes from around the world. Well, while teams are practicing and looking forward to the NCAA Women's Basketball Tournament, there are two programs that are looking to take their programs in a new direction. Kansas State fired Deb Patterson and hired rival TCU coach Jeff Mittie. Arkansas also fired their head coach Tom Collins after 7 seasons. But we're going to talk about the Kansas State situation. Heather, I know that if you don't win as a coach, the AD can choose to fire you at any time. This is prominent in men's sports because their programs bring in revenue for the school, and they're in the public eye more often. But we don't really hear about women's coaches being fired too often because of 1 or 2 losing seasons. However, it is the nature of coaching, and every coach knows this is in the back of their mind. Do you think the AD has too much leniency in firing coaches?
Well, it's short. You know, you see ADs that don't take enough initiative, and they could, and then you're like, well, why aren't you doing anything? You know, why aren't you taking action? And then you see those ADs that, you know, kind of run the show, and you're like, dude, why don't you just sit back and watch and let people do their job? But I don't know. I mean, that's a hard one without knowing all the ins and outs, but it depends on the AD, it depends on the school, it depends on the program.
Well, I mean, as you know, the high schools have growth plans in place for teachers and coaches. Do you think that maybe colleges should do growth plans before they toss them to the side?
I mean, I think they kind of do, don't they? I mean, do you need a growth plan to know that, hey, you need to be winning? That's why you're there. You're not teaching a class. You are literally there to recruit and to play. And that's it. That's your job. That's what you're there for. So if you're not doing the winning because you're not recruiting well or you're not coaching well, I mean, do you need to be reminded of that? Or you coached in college, is that something you needed to be reminded of, that you needed to win?
Of course, it's not something as a coach that you need to be reminded of, but as a coach who built a legacy like this Kansas State coach, I guess I would think there would be more emphasis on building a legacy there and maybe giving them more of an opportunity.
It's not like she was dragging the program through the mud. It's not like they weren't doing well. So to just be able to toss her aside without having really reason, I mean, that would be an abuse of power. Maybe she couldn't be controlled. Maybe she was too powerful on campus, you know, and the AD wanted to assert his authority and gain control of the programs.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the Kansas State coaching change. Listen to these stats and tell me if her contributions to the Wildcats would make you as an AD think firing her was the best decision. So Deb Patterson gave Kansas State 18 seasons with a record of 350 wins to 226 losses.
Okay.
She held the career number of wins at Kansas State, and her team was consistently ranked in the top 25 nationally. She was the longest tenured coach and has more NCAA tournament appearances and the most 20-win seasons of any of the coaches before her. With all this success early on in her coaching career, there may have been nowhere to go but down. And we as coaches talk about getting our players to peak at the right time in season, and I think this was ultimately the demise for Coach Patterson. When you, as a coach or school, are exemplary, for example, for so long, the only place to go is down. She has 2 seasons where the team was 5-13 in conference, and one of those years she lost 3 starters to injuries. So Heather, when you lose players that impact your team, I know the coach is at a disadvantage.
For sure. I mean, basketball is one of those sports that you have an all-star player, one, and it changes the whole game. Your team goes from a 5-13 team to a 13-5 team pretty quickly. So, you know, LeBron James showed that in Cleveland. The guy was amazing. They were good. Basketball is that kind of sport. So if you lose 3, I mean, you hate to call it practice season, but that's kind of what it becomes unless you have somebody else that comes out of the woodwork that you totally unexpected that came out and just started playing for you and getting results. Obviously, that should be taken into consideration. It's one of those things that you can't help. Somebody blows their ACL out. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, we both played for teams where players before you have left a legacy. And this, to me, is like firing Pat Clement. You just don't fire a coach who has built your program over the past 18 years because she had 2 bad seasons.
Yeah, there have definitely been worse coaches given more leniency, in the history of NCAA sports in general. I mean, there have been some really bad seasons in programs and that have been allowed to continue, 3, 4, 5 years before they've done something about it. So they probably should have done it, but I'm thinking it's a little bit more along the lines of they wanted to put somebody else in there that they might could control, because clearly she's been there longer than the AD. It's her program.
Well, let's compare her replacement, Jess Mitty, who was the head women's basketball coach from TCU for the past 15 seasons. TCU and Kansas State are rivals in the Big 12 Conference. So Kansas State took a risk stealing him away from TCU. Mitty has a record of 454 wins and 234 losses as a head coach overall in the past 22 years. He has had only 1 losing season in the last 22 years as well. But I do have to say that it's very impressive. But after looking at his strength of schedule during preseason, he played small Division I teams like Abilene Christian, Texas State, and Prairie View A&M, where his team beat most of the teams prior to conference by 30 points. So did you think that is a strategic plan on his part to play weaker teams? He ended his season last year 18-14 overall and 8-10 in conference.
Oh, sure. Sure it is. I mean, you'd be a fool not to think that, or a fool not to do that. If you don't have a very strong team and you know it, you've had the win column way before you get into your, conference that you probably don't really belong in. So, yeah, it's absolutely intentional. It's just the same thing that, football programs do to get bowl eligible because they're in a harder conference or they have a weak team. I mean, you have to also take his 400-plus wins over his career. I mean, you have to be thinking, how many of those preseason games have been against, passy teams, and how many times he's done that over his 22 years of coaching. Probably a lot. So it doesn't take a genius. He's won some games though, but obviously when it gets into conference, that winning percentage tanks. Is TCU in the tournament? Obviously not. How many times have they been? How many times has he taken them to the tournament? These are all things that should be looked at and weighted very heavily. To oust her for somebody that might not be as comparable as far as success, in the tournament-wise, because that's really what it matters, it's just garbage.
He's got a great coaching record, but when you put his resume side by side next to Coach Patterson, to me, this is not a move I would have made. I'm not sure if this was a coaching decision as much as it was a financial decision by the university. The biggest difference in these two coaches is the salary. Kansas State was paying the former coach Patterson $600,000 a year, and it's paying the current coach Mitty $375,000 a year.
Yeah.
Heather, do you think the politics had anything to do with this decision?
I think that's the reason. I mean, that's just smoking gun right there. That's why she got fired. And anybody that says otherwise is trying to do some kind of little dance around the obvious. You don't get a coach that, for them to say, oh, we've got a great record, but we're going to pay you half of what Coach Patterson was making. I think it had a lot to do with, like I said, she had a lot of influence at that school because she'd been there forever. She had a lot of power, and she was making a lot of money. She was also winning. So it appears that they waited for their chance for her to have her off 2 years when she lost some key players, 3 of them, for them to get her out of there. And they took the opportunity to do it. And, it might work out for them, but it might not. So.
Yeah, I think it's going to come back and haunt that AD. And, he basically put his career on the line as well, because if it doesn't pan out and they get worse, I mean, that's his job. So he must have, felt pretty confident about it, and I'm sure he's crossing his fingers for the next year.
I mean, he's going to have a leeway, because you gotta do your, I'm got to implement my program. So, and these aren't my players. When it'll come is when, 4 or 5 years, when he's playing with his players, his program is established, and you see.
Jeff Mitty's on a 5-year contract, so we'll see after 5 years. But I feel confident that Deb Patterson will get plenty of phone calls for head coaching jobs, and that I would not want to be the coach who fills her big shoes at Kansas State. So talk about pressure.
Yeah. I mean, well deserved. I wouldn't want to be him. It's never good to be that guy that follows a legend. It's never good to be the person that follows somebody like Pat Summitt. It'll be interesting to see how this works out.
As always, we will keep you up to date on the NCAA Women's Basketball Tournament and women's sports news. For Janet TV on the radio, this is Coach G.